So we are talking today because D9 has acquired Verne Global. So I guess for a lot of folks, it'd be interesting just to have a little bit of background on D9 as an investment company, a bit of history. And I think I'm right thinking digital infrastructure is one of your major focus, which it broadly breaks down into connectivity of various descriptions and obviously in this case, data centers. So yeah, if you can give us a bit of background.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Yes, D9 is a listed investment trust. The ticker is DGI9, Digital 9. I'll explain where the name comes from, but it's an investment trust that's managed by Triple Point. It's a pure play digital infrastructure investment trust. We're investing in 4 different subsectors, as we'd call it, within digital infrastructure. Each investment managed in their own, within their own respect. But there's those 4 subsectors are subsea fiber. We have an investment platform there called Aquacomms, subsea network fiber business, one of the largest and pure play independents in the world, but a strong position in the Atlantic basin. That's subsea. Data centers, of which, of course, Verne Global, which we'll discuss today as a major investment. We also are focused on terrestrial fiber networks and wireless infrastructure. So those 4 subsectors. What makes us unique to some degree, I think, is our purpose. So the name itself, D9, it comes from the UN Sustainability Goal number 9. And that has 2 implications of how we look at investments and screen investments and then manage the investments going forward. And those 2 implications come directly from that UN sustainability goal, which is to improve connectivity, bridging the digital divide, and secondly, to invest in an environmentally sustainable way, and really to show specifically leadership within the data center industry on decarbonization and true decarbonization. So that's the investment trust. We've raised 750 million pounds. We've deployed 430 of that. And the investment trust model, if it's not widely understood, is it's a permanent capital vehicle. We will look to continue to invest, deploy capital, and raise capital against that. And what we've discussed with our investors is a 2 billion target NAV within 3 years.
Okay, so I guess the next obvious question is why Verne Global? So there are obviously lots of data center players out there. What attracted to them? And maybe Dominic can come in and put the reverse. Was Verne Global looking to be acquired? Is it I'm guessing it's a welcome, but just the sort of the process of how Verne Global came to be acquired would be good to hear.
Yes. Well, first I'd say, one of the investment strategies that although we look at each investment in their own individual capacities, we do believe that there's benefit of having these different investment platforms continue to accrue. And one of the themes has been for us, how do we improve network connectivity to improve the data center opportunity, specifically in the Nordics? And the Nordic opportunity for us is really about how do we shift the energy footprint or energy sink of the data center industry and help enable that to move to areas where there's surplus renewable energy. And really trying to manage that, an economy that has more of a finite set of renewables or is still net hydrocarbon dependent, and helping migrate that and play its part in shifting some of that capacity to the Nordics. So really to look at the Aquacomms network as an opportunity, an investment opportunity in of itself, to then also enable a broader industry in the Nordics. And so the natural answer to that is, of course, the Nordic data center opportunity was a perfect fit for us in terms of how we can look to benefit from that broader investment platform, but specifically meeting the criteria that we set out in terms of the UN Sustainability Goal number 9, and truly decarbonizing the data center industry. Now, what interested us about Verne specifically, and you'll hear it from Dominic, because everything I've just been talking about and really summarizing it, we could spend an hour on it, is exactly where these guys started. It's exactly what their mission has been from day one. And so there was just a natural fit. An aligning of the planets in a certain way that ultimately just made it a very attractive acquisition for us. And for us, some of the key features of an investment, the management team, the quality of the management team. I should be careful a little bit what I say with Dominic listening, but just the strength of that team that have worked together for so long, all aligned around a similar purpose and vision that we have, and that you won't see all the time. That's in some ways a rarity. So that really drove us into it. And then, of course, the attractive opportunity for us in terms of as an investment, we believe that it's a very scalable platform, scalable not just at the site within Iceland, but then more broadly. This team have a fantastic track record of operations and building high quality sites for that high performance compute part of the industry.
Yeah, and I guess I can. Yeah, sure. I can add to that a bit. You asked one specific question: were we seeking acquisition? The answer to that is actually no. We were continuing to build. That being said, there has been a significant amount of interest that has been growing, particularly around the Nordic data center community, because of what's been happening over the last few years. And as we really focus on what Thor's just been highlighting around the carbon footprint of the data center industry that has been growing so significantly, particularly over the last 10 years. When you go back to the very thesis that Verne Global was premised upon, which was around a digital infrastructure footprint for data centers that was built on total sustainability from the very beginning, then we look at what's been happening with the growth in the industry, particularly from the high intensity compute and the high performance compute that's been growing so rapidly over the last several years. And you're starting to see the tensions build and rise, particularly in the more developed primary or core locations where data centers have historically been developed. Now we're starting to see the pressure really build. And over the course of the last 5 years, and maybe even more so in the last couple of years, we've seen the attention on sustainability for any power resource, but certainly for the data center industry, have a light shone upon it. And that's really where we've started to see the real interest in our end users, our data center customers, starting to think about the source of power, starting to think about where it's most efficient for their compute to sit in the world. And that's really the driver of growth that we're really starting to see. And there's been an inflection over the last several years. And so we're delighted to now be owned and acquired recently by D9, because the vision that D9 has this absolutely aligned focus to what has been at the heart of our mission from the very beginning. So very pleased to be now owned by D9 with the alignment that we have.
It sounds as if, this is the start of a journey for both of you, but also in terms of expanding. So I'm wondering, is Verne Global going to become a sort of brand that you're going to acquire other data centers or even build from new? And funny enough, I was talking to someone the other day and suggested to them, not entirely flippantly, that it would make sense moving forward to build other than data centers where they had to be, say in next to financial centers where latency is critical. But for most of us, a couple of milliseconds is neither here nor there. Building data centers sort of in and around the Nordics, etc., makes complete sense because, as you alluded to, Dominic, sustainability, you've got plentiful hydropower, renewables, and the temperatures help, to minimize the requirement for cooling. So whether one or both of you want to say something about that.
I'm happy to jump in with one thing, if I may, Tor, which is just this enormous change in perception of end users. And one of the great things that's been happening over the last few years has been that a lot of end users, a lot of data center customers have realized that already a lot of their applications, their workflows, are already sitting in an outsourced environment. Because whether they liked it or not, it started with things like their email exchange server that became a cloud-based application. And then all the way down to mission critical applications for their business, their core applications have now moved to environments, whether they be cloud or outsourced co-location. And that shift in mentality is really significant. So we've moved away from the traditional data center environments that customers and end users, most enterprises, used to have their computers in their basement And that has been a paradigm shift that has been changing very rapidly. And we've now got to the point where end users, customers, are starting to think in a much more sophisticated manner. And the reason they can do that is because they're now thinking about not just their total compute footprint, but they're actually thinking about their applications. Where is the most efficient location for my application? Does my application have to sit in a city center location, which costs an absolute fortune and doesn't have the possibility to be powered by sustainable energy? Or can that application sit in a much more efficient and sustainable location where the infrastructure is built specifically for that application? And that's the shift that has now been enabled, and we're really seeing that trend accelerate. And so in the context of the global applications that can sit outside of those previously core regional locations, we saw huge developments in locations like London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Paris. But that shift has now enabled customers to use applications and infrastructure in different locations, optimized for their workflows. And that is the vast majority of applications. It's not just a subset, it is the vast majority of applications do not need to sit in those core, more expensive and certainly not renewable locations. That's the bit that's really changing and is so exciting. And so the opportunity set continues to grow as that mindset has shifted towards thinking about application optimization and infrastructure that supports it to be in different locations.
Yeah, and when you interpose in, cost of electricity and that sustainability element that's core to it, that sophistication of assessing how does that impact that application use, I think grows, and it is growing exponentially. And for us, although Verne is classically labeled as a high performance compute, we do think that opportunity grows. So to come back to the question of are we going to grow? How are we going to grow this business? We do believe it's scalable. We believe the asset site is scalable, have the potential to go up to 100 megawatts. But we think more broadly, this skill set, this team that have worked together for years and years under this vision, as Dominic just articulated, and under that really just even within the Nordics itself.
And in terms of the slightly bigger picture, smart cities, for example, have been around, the concept for quite a while, and progress is being made in various locations across the globe. How do you see yourselves playing to that? And I'm just wondering as well, because obviously the edge is beginning to become more talked about, and bringing compute and maybe micro data centers, whatever, closer. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that, because I'm not saying this is counterintuitive to that, because clearly larger facilities are still required to do a lot of the the number crunching at more central locations. But just wondering again, both of your thoughts on your sort of philosophy as compared with smart cities and maybe more edge computing applications.
I mean, certainly from a high level, I'd say it depends on how you define the edge. And everyone has a very different view of what that edge is. Ultimately for us, as we, again, also with that aquacomms layer and improving that network connectivity, can we redefine the edge for the perspective of that application use for certain end users, and redefine how that balances across their broader data center usage? So that's just one smaller point. I mean, as an investor, we are going to look at more metro facilities where we can help enhance the connectivity. We have a platform through aquacomms, providing that access to that international fabric, and a big platform of customers that we think, okay, how do we leverage that within a metro facility, improving its connectivity in the local community, but then providing access to a broader international footprint, including to data centers like Verne Global. So that will always be part of it. We're looking at landing stations as well. How do we take these landing stations that we own and operate through the aquacomms fabric and leverage that as a data center opportunity? And again, putting it in the context of against a broader international fabric and where applications can be used, and looking at that site as a high level of resilience in that international fiber fabric.
And I think I can just add an extra comment there, which is, I think what we're beginning to see is the expansion of how we distribute infrastructure, data processing, data storage, and communication between that data location in a much more sophisticated manner than we've ever seen. And this is really the change that is only just beginning. When we look at internet traffic statistics and see the growth where the zettabytes, which is a number that is almost impossible to fathom, grows at 50% over a 2 to 3 year period every few years in the next decade. Huge amounts of data that starts to flow around the world. And we're going to need to develop infrastructure in a different way than we have done previously. Now, some of that does still need to be centralized. And the model to this point has been very centralized compute, because it really has been sitting in a certain number of fixed locations, a number of larger central locations. But what you're starting to see is the proliferation of data in a very different way. And as we start to add in more sophisticated uses, the often quoted, of course, is things like autonomous driving. And you're going to then need the rapid communication point on smaller locations where processing will need to happen more rapidly in a huge extra fabric of infrastructure. And of course, the other thing that needs to sit between that is the data communications, another really critical part of D9's strategy. And so what I think we're just starting to begin to see is this extra layer, this extra fabric starting to not just look like a hub and spoke model, but actually just a completely interconnected woven model, a mesh, if you will, that has different types of infrastructure depending upon how data needs to be consumed, processed, and stored and pushed to other locations. But we're really just starting to see that. And I think it's a very exciting point in time. Now, of course, not all data can be processed in the same location, nor should it. And it all is going to be labeled in a certain way. And that's the bit that I think is so exciting, because you will see data, applications, and workflows being labeled and hopefully optimized so that they then can sit in this mesh network according to almost priority and their own individual characteristics. So that's the exciting development that's going to see the next 10 years of development in this entire digital infrastructure world.
Yeah.
Just to that point, do you think it's important, practical, or doesn't really matter that sort of that end to end from, you know, a centralized facility all the way down to a fairly local edge, that these are owned by one organization that can therefore optimize it? Or is it inevitable that you'll just have a load of connectivity options to get from A to B to C, sort of pros and cons of those approaches?
I mean, certainly if I take that initially, our philosophy has always been that, carrier neutral open access model at all layers of the infrastructure. And I think that's absolutely essential, because one player cannot do all of it at every segment of that value chain. And it's really important that the industry, run towards that of saying we will be open at every layer of it. Now, of course, there's a benefit of collaboration. One of the aspects of how this will all, unfold in our view is that software-defined network layer, and in using that to really help customers be able to automate that access and that smart access to that application layer, and how that gets optimized across the broader footprint. Terrestrial fiber networks, optimizing that, the subsea layer, and then data centers. And for us as an investor, we looking at it, we look at each individual segment and saying, well, how do we optimize? How do we maximize the flow of traffic? And it definitively will not be trying to create a captive, vertically integrated value chain. That absolutely is not our philosophy.
Okay. Sorry, we're going to move on to sustainability as a sort of broader picture in a minute. But just before that, if I can ask Dominic, I think you've announced a sort of partnership with Endor fairly recently. Perhaps you can just fill us in on the impact of that.
Yeah, it's something that's hugely important to us, is having the right ecosystem. And the right ecosystem for us involves a lot of partners. And those partners may be associated with power or network or in the case of Endor, particularly IT services support and the kind of service provision that is required by our customers. Endor has developed a phenomenal business over the last decade, supporting customers that are particularly focused on high performance computing and increasingly high intensity computing. And they have indeed supported a number of our customers over that period of time. And they have really found, to some extent, a specialism in this world of high performance computing and high intensity computing, but have been very much at the heart now of how customers expand their strategy and implement that strategy within data center environments. So delighted to be working in deeper partnership than ever with Endor, who continue to support a number of our very high profile customers and indeed customers that you won't necessarily heard of as well. But they are a phenomenal team that has really focused on this segment, which continues to grow at pace. So a very well-trusted partner that we've been working with for a long time.
Okay, thanks for that. And then the broader picture, I guess it's a fairly open-ended debate. We're all familiar with the issues, but I'd be very interested in both your views. You know, sustainability within the data center. Clearly, the Verne Global model is right up there. But I'm just wondering how you would, you know, judge the industry, yourselves, but also the industry more generally in terms of what's been achieved today. I sort of crudely characterize it as most companies, you know, will plant a load of trees to offset our carbon footprint, and that's about where we're at. But I think most of them are aware we potentially need to go further. But just thoughts, I suppose, as to where the industry is now and what's required. You know, is it a massive sea change or just a continual evolution?
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting characteristic, actually, which is the most they've done is plant some trees. Of course, there's a bit of a problem when they don't plant that many trees and you get a storm that knocks all the trees down. So it kind of undoes the work that you would hope they have done. So sustainability, it has been at the very core of our strategy, the very reason why we decided to locate in Iceland from the beginning. And going back quite a long time now, the original concept was very much premised on sustainability of power. And Iceland does distinguish itself as the only country in Europe that generates all of its electricity from renewable power. There are two sources. There's hydroelectric and geothermal. They're actually just starting to look at wind as well, which if you've ever been to Iceland, and if you haven't, you should, you'll find that it is actually quite windy as well as very cool, which is not necessarily the best place from a tourist perspective, although it is a beautiful, stunning place. It is perfect for data centers. And again, that was the absolute perfect combo for the data center industry, having this renewable source of power that was 100% green and combining that with the climate, which enables us to derive further efficiencies, have lower capital expenditure because we need less infrastructure to keep servers and compute equipment cool. Means we just get this double benefit. And so our focus has been on that from the very beginning. And over the course of the last decade or more, that interest has, I would say, been a little bit bumpy. It's been a bit benign in terms of the end users focusing on sustainability. And yet in the last few years, we've seen the light, as I said before, the light totally now shining upon this part of the infrastructure decision-making process. And that's the exciting bit. What I think the industry continues to do is continue to grow at a rapid rate, but not necessarily have its eye totally on the sustainability angle. And there's a lot of operators that do a lot, and they do a decent thing around thinking about their power source. And increasingly, there are ways, and have been over the last several years, to do something about that, which is, in some cases, buying certificates of origin or guarantees of origin, or perhaps they're working directly with power utility companies if they're substantial enough to buy power that comes from a PPA, a power purchase agreement, that can be green. But there's something really interesting about the fundamentals. If you go down to the level of physics, where do the electrons come from? And that's the bit that is very different in Iceland, frankly, to anywhere else. And so what I'd go back to is just this focus on sustainability. It's just really exciting at the moment because people are really starting to think, well, that's great. I've got the certificate that says my power is green. But if I'm in the UK, where actually there's still quite a lot of coal power, certainly a lot of gas and oil powering the grid, how can my power truly be green? And in fact, that substitution of, well, if my power is green and it means somebody else's isn't, still remains a challenge point. But there is more to be done. And I think this goes to the heart of our mission, our strategy, which is how do we ensure that that infrastructure is green? And then the other thing that is really significant is that power is increasingly constrained. You will have seen over the last few days the commentary in the press around gas prices and the electricity price impact that is likely to have in the UK alone, let alone on the whole of the rest of Europe and beyond. Well, this is a real tension point. And as we start to see data centers consuming massive amounts of power in certain locations, and turn your eyes to Dublin, for an example, where we've seen over the course of the last few months, the government of Ireland starting to challenge the data center industry, saying, we've had enough. We could get to the point at this rate of growth where data centers could be consuming 30 or 50% of our total power on the grid over the course of the next 10 years. When you compare that to the global footprint of data centers, which is probably less than 3% of total energy consumption around the world, that is a scary statistic to think that it could be 1/3 of Ireland's power grid soaked up with data centers. So this is something that does need to be fixed, because we're seeing this huge and exponential, and it truly is an exponential growth in data and the processing that needs to sit around that, and therefore the power that needs to drive it. So we do need to do something, and we do need to focus on the sustainability of data center infrastructures wherever we can.
Yeah. I mean, the understanding the impact of your energy footprint in the broader environment you live in, or the broader power grid you live in, is critical. So you can go by the offsets by a less baseload renewable source and say that you've balanced your energy footprint in effect. But on the broader pool, all you've created is ultimately you're sucking up that green energy from the broader production, and the volatility that's put on that grid from that intermittent source from wind is ultimately now just sucked up by a worse emitter of hydrocarbons to match that volatility. And it's really trying to look at the broader perspective. Now, I think the answer may not be, criticizing the greenwashing in the data center industry as much as it might be, we need to work on that network layer, making it easier for customers to take that perspective of application usage and migrate the applications and that data center usage of that application to sustainable areas like Iceland and the broader Nordics. Like, making that easier for the customer, I think, is the challenge of the industry. And that's not just, of course, the data center industry.
And there's a really nice, almost a soundbite around this, which it is very expensive to export power, but comparatively, it is very low cost to export data. And that's a really important dynamic for people to get their heads around.
And just quickly before my sort of final question about the upcoming COP26, I'm just curious, there's always been a bit of a tension between, shall we say, making money and sustainability, and that balance is maybe changing. But I'm curious, for yourselves as an organisation, are you able to square, or you're happy that sustainability is your sort of priority, and clearly you're there to make some money, but it's not the be all and end all, whereas once upon a time maybe investment was all about maximum return and environmental considerations were perhaps a little lower down the agenda?
The beauty of the investment trust and that permanent capital vehicle and our long-term sustainable targets is that we believe in the predictability, and that we can find investments, and we're delivering on investments that have that predictable return component. So for us, it's about looking at the long term, but the fantastic opportunity that we're seeing is there's a convergence. Look at electricity prices. Look at what's happened there, and the opportunity within Verne to exercise upon that disparity of electricity prices right now. That's also sustainable. If on one view, the reality is that sustainable picture is the profit opportunity for the long term. It's the only way we can create that sustainable profit.
One of the things to really focus on there is that if you get it right, you can definitely in the long term make higher returns on capital from investing in sustainable investment opportunities. And just what is driving that, just to really highlight what Thor just said, the power in Iceland is so much lower cost than when you compare it to, say, Germany or the UK. Actually, just the comparative, green does not have to be more expensive. Sustainability does not have to come at additional cost. And that's the thing that is changing. And so the longer term horizon on that really makes it very exciting for investors to think about sustainability at the core of their investment strategy for the first time.
Mm.
And sort of as we finish COP26, it's been sort of hovering on the horizon for a while as it's nearly upon us. I guess, again, both of you be interesting. Are you optimistic that sort of the nettle will finally be grasped in a sort of meaningful fashion, or do you think they're, sorry to use the cliches, but the can's going to get kicked a little bit further down the road? And to the data center, I'm sure they won't, announce something around data centers specifically, but so far the industry, as with many, has sort of self-regulated and sort of made some progress voluntarily. Do you think there will come a time when industries, including the data center industry, will, whether it's, you mentioned the sort of Dublin example, whatever, where governments will start, laying down actual legislation as to what they require from data centers? I'm thinking, for example, older data centers, there's only so much you can do with them. However much you improve them, they're probably not very environmentally friendly. Just thoughts about, COP26, optimistic, pessimistic, and sort of, whether governments are going to start getting interested in regulating data centers. If that's, we've only got about, well, no, we could do this for another hour, but the short answer, if possible.
I'll give, you give your view, and then I'll give my view.
Jump in. Go on.
I'll be very quick. I'm optimistic that the governments will progress things, but I'm more optimistic in the long-term solutions that the industry will provide with more authenticity, and the focus on authenticity of that sustainability. Really looking at what your impact is on the broader economy and that energy footprint that you're creating. And I think customers will demand it. Industry will demand it. So I'm optimistic in the government side, but I'm more optimistic in the long-term solutions that the industry will drive. Dominic?
Yeah, and I'll give you a little bit more specific around the data center industry, but just before I do, I think the COP26 objectives, that they are quite broad, and there's a lot in there around just trying to generally improve our approach globally to sustainability. So I think we'll definitely see governments starting to sign up to some of the initiatives, and obviously some of the core objectives are quite basic, which is we want to reduce coal emissions or the use of coal. We want to improve sustainability for infrastructure. Those kind of things are broad goals. The question then, when you drill down, is how does that get deployed, and how does that proactively drive change? And I think that's a very interesting point. It's also quite difficult to implement across all of the industries concerned because it's such a global challenge. But I think as a result of it being a global challenge, the difficulty is, of course, just trying to create the momentum and then maintain the momentum or even accelerate it over time. But I do think the fact that it's happening, the fact that it is going to be an engagement for governments to have an opportunity to have a set point, I think we'll hopefully see some progress made. So I remain optimistic on that. More specifically to your other points, regulation, legislation, the impacts particularly on digital infrastructure as an industry. Well, I'm going to say I think it's less relevant than the customer demand, because it is the customers who have in place now ESG policies or drivers towards sustainability that are making our industries change. The digital infrastructure industry is changing because customers are demanding, and that is going to accelerate the kind of change needed way faster than regulation or legislation that may take a long time to process and come in and actually need to be very different in different territories. So I think the incentive is going to be there if not already, but it is going to be driven, in my mind, by customers, not necessarily by the regulation and legislation which might hit other industries.
Okay, and I apologies, a final question. Net zero is again a term thrown around. How possible, bearing in mind some of the things we talked about and the massive explosion in data, data centers are sometimes called digital factories. Factories, although they can improve their environmental performance, you've got visions of sort of smoke pouring out, stuff like that. I mean, there's almost a conflict, isn't there? We want more digital infrastructure, digital services, taking pics on our phones, streaming videos. How compatible is that activity, I guess, with making the data center industry net zero? And do you think there might even have to be a pushback that people begin to understand the real cost of, all their digital demands, and then, whether it's a limit on, storage space or whatever, or you have to pay a increasingly large cost? Just thoughts at how achievable net zero is, within the digital age we live in.
Well, I think we can always do more on net zero. There's always going to be a challenge where we're trying to pursue the improvements in efficiency and thinking more about the impact of the entire chain of data, whether that's the transmission, the processing, the storage, or anything around data. Now, I think it's almost impossible to change consumer habits. And I think the fact that people take however many photos on their phone or videos on their phone, or consume Netflix, or sending any of the kind of transmission or receiving transmission on their phones, their laptops, their iPads, that is a trend that is here to stay and will continue to accelerate. I think it's very, very hard to reverse that. And so I think the challenge is more how you respond to that. And I think that's the critical point that we as an industry can respond to, and we can all be doing more. If you look at the industry very broadly, there still remains a very small fragment of it, which is truly sustainable. And even on that side of things, we're only just starting to see the implementation of new technology. How do we deal with the reuse of heat, for example? How do we deal with carbon capture? And that's only just beginning to be part of the ecosystem in the data center world. And it's fine. It may work in some jurisdictions and not in others. That's definitely going to be the case. But we can definitely do more. And that is a trend that is only just beginning. So as we head towards carbon zero over the industry, this is going to take not just a few years, but decades to change, particularly as infrastructure is built for a long period of time. It's going to be decades before you see the older infrastructure actually no longer being used or no longer fit for use. So it's a long-term initiative. We're only just beginning to see those initiatives coming through on how we really focus on changing the entire end-to-end supply chain of the data center industry and the digital infrastructure industry more broadly.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I've used up quite a lot of your time, but it's been great and some brilliant insights around data centers specifically and sustainability more generally. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.